The Connector Next Door is your invitation to meet the natural connectors all around us. They represent the everyday event planners who are energizing their communities every single day. Their stories are familiar, fun, and full of charm. Your host, Lisa Garrow, is a lifelong event planner and has been a connection strategy coach for over a decade. She knows events can become energized connecting points where communities can gather and grow. Let's listen in as she strikes up a conversation with today's Connector Next Door.
Jason Bacon is a coach, consultant, and champion of entrepreneurship. As the founder of Sunstone Strategic, he works with startups, side hustlers, and solopreneurs. Sunstone was built on the mission of moving business forward. But it's not all business for Jason. He's written a book called Entrepreneur-ish: Inspiration and Lessons in Entrepreneurship from Vikings, Pirates, and Samurai. With its December release, he's having some fun digging into history, but also challenging the current view of what it means to be an entrepreneur. Jason says entrepreneurship is about action, not the title of entrepreneur. When I first met Jason, I was telling him about our upcoming course and community called The Connection Architect, and we wanted to build cohorts that were active, moving, growing, connecting with each other. Jason encourages entrepreneurs to really explore who they are, what they know, and who is in their circle that can help them grow. When we talk to impact-driven event planners, the same principles apply. Actively engaging in our projects, our people, and our partnerships is the way forward. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Connector Next Door. And I am really glad that, Jason, you are here with me today. We've had a bunch of conversations in the last couple of months, but really to talk about connection, I think you've got such a cool perspective. So I'm excited to jump in.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be doing this.
We're coming up on the holidays here. We're in November.
Yeah.
And everyone just seems like they're screeching to the finish line of what 2021 has been. How are you feeling? What's going on for you these days?
I'm feeling great. We didn't even mention this before we started recording. Today's my daughter's third birthday when we're recording this, so I'm super excited. And it's closer to the end of the year, so it's something that kind of keeps us going. And I'm very conscious of keeping it separate from Christmas. So I think to an extent it's different when you're an entrepreneur, and I have felt a very great flow for the past month or so, and getting very busy and talking to a lot of different people and just feeling energized. So yeah, I'm just in that, as I say, I'm living the dream.
Amazing. Yeah. I've been hearing a lot about the Great Resignation. You probably too, sort of from regular workplace or what people are choosing work looks like. And I was just emailing a friend this morning that it feels like 2022 is going to be a bit of a reset, where events have been upside down and shook up and, tossed around. And now we're looking at 2022 where the new normal feels a little more normal, where we're really starting to figure out what does it look like. But you're right. I think sometimes we really have to focus on the moment too, looking out to what did the next 6 and 10 months look like, but to really savor those moments that we have today with our family and the people that matter to us here.
I'm fond of saying life is defined in moments and refined in time. And, you talked about the Great Resignation, and that's, for those that don't know, it's plus 40% of people, it's a little bit over 40% want to leave their jobs wholesale, just want to get out because they're unhappy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's when you look at COVID and the, my firm belief is it became very exclusionary for people. They started to feel very alone. They started to feel a lot of pressure. They, a lot of the things that they would do to de-stress were taken away from them. And it was a very stressful time where the cracks started to show even more, right? And and that other path, that other side of it, that other grass is greener type of place is entrepreneurship. Often when they're talking about this Great Resignation, right, the scale and scope of entrepreneurship is totally changing, and I think that's what fuels great resignation and the concept of that grass is greener, because it is becoming like the supports are there. And I think that people are seeing that maybe it is a viable path, right? Where before they talk themselves out of it. I think that it comes down to kind of three key factors. And this is, it's effectual entrepreneurship is what it's called.
Okay.
And this is something I talk a little bit in my book, Entrepreneurship. I talk about this idea using the story of some Vikings. And the entire idea is effectual entrepreneurship is a way for you to take action based on what you can control and where you can create real value. And it's three different things. It's who you are, it's what you know, and most importantly for our conversation, it's who you know. And that piece, I think that often people, especially in the digital age, overlook.
Absolutely. And it's interesting as you're talking about entrepreneurs and really the essence of this conversation for the people that I serve. So these are people that are planning and promoting their own events, and events can become the lifeblood of the work that they do. And a lot of entrepreneurs that run their own events online or otherwise, there is a rhythm that starts to be created event after event. And I call them connection points over time. And the cool thing that we start to see happen is the effort to the results and to success really becomes tighter. So less effort, more results, better connections over time. So it's the consistency that's created. The lack of consistency for us in the last year and a half to almost 2 years now in using events as a marketing tool or using events as a sales tool. I think it's thrown some people for a loop because they're feeling like they're trying different things. They're kind of throwing out, something spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks when it comes to your connections. What are you finding that actually works? So if connections and who you know really matters as much as you're saying it does, and I believe you're right there, then what? Like what are you seeing people, like where are those innovations for us to really connect in deeper ways?
And I honestly, I think part of it is geared towards this community that you're talking to, like the events that are being put on is where really this, a lot of this onus is being put on those, right? And, before I stepped into entrepreneurship, before I came into this world, I was running ATB's entrepreneur education strategy, right? ATB Financial. And we talked a lot about, in the digital world, how do you create something that's engaging? How do you create something that, to be quite frank, what makes this different than a recording? If you were to record whatever it is that you're doing and release it, what makes this, why am I going to show up? What is my time has this inherent value that entrepreneurs understand, right? And so it's those networking pieces, I think, that are so important that really do draw those entrepreneurs in, right? My business is called Sunstone Strategic, and it comes from the idea of I love history, and the idea to me of they never knew how Vikings made it across the Atlantic Ocean, and because it was 1,000 years before the invention of the compass, they were out of sight of land, alone in a storm in the middle of the sea in a boat with people that they could trust. That metaphor to me is so entrepreneurship, right? That is so, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. but what is that next step, right? And I think that often it's about the people that you surround yourself with that can help to kind of illuminate the way. And in terms of how you do it, one of my other favorite sayings, because I've apparently, as I become a father, become just incredibly more cliche.
It comes with this territory.
I just give off serious dad vibes now, but it's one of my things that I say is, everyone's self-centered. All that differs is the radius. And if you want true partnerships, it can't be self-centered. It cannot be about, this is what I want. I was had an entrepreneur I was working with. They wanted to initiate a partnership. And I said, if you really want to do it, here's 3 things you need to think about. Why? So this is the purpose part. And I think that a lot of people overlook this when it comes to partnerships. And it's half of entrepreneurship. I always talk about success being a balance between drive that pushes you forward and purpose that pulls you forward. And that idea of the why behind why are you in business? Why are you doing what you're doing? And why do you want to connect with this other organization or company? Do they have a similar belief as you? If you're someone that, is solely motivated by profit, and you're trying to partner with a company that wants to save the environment. That partnership is not going to go anywhere. That fundamental, those beliefs, there has to be some sort of connection or alignment, right? And so,
Yeah.
it's great if you want to partner with someone, but there has to be a deeper connection in my mind.
Yeah.
The second thing that I gave her as a kind of question to ask was, what do they need from you, right? What are 3 things that you think, by the way, they need from you? Because you don't know. You don't actually know what they need from you potentially, right?
Yeah.
And then the third and final one was, well, now what do you need from them? And then the whole idea is you go and meet with them and you make sure that your guesses are right, and you actually figure that out. You figure out what do they actually need at the end of the day, and figure out, is there an alignment there, right?
It's beautiful. And you said earlier about who you know and how important it is who you know. And I've moved several times, and I've lived in different cities, and professionally also run my business in different cities.
Totally.
And so when I come into a city and I know no one, and the who you know is still important. But for those of you that are out there kind of listening to this and you're like, well, I don't know anybody. I didn't go to, business school, and I don't have a group of alumni. And I was just going to say it's no excuse. I don't want to sort of be the big heavy, but I think that sometimes we skip that part because we feel like, well, we don't know anyone. So we're just going to track through, and make our way and build our own road. Yeah. Sometimes we have to do that as an entrepreneur, but if we're doing it ourselves, we really won't get where we potentially could be unless we start looking for ways to create that kind of environment where who starts to expand. Your work with ATB, because you had mentioned that as well, building a cohort, for example, you have to know who's in the room before you can start really solidifying how are we going to work together. And what you're talking about partnerships, it feels like that kind of same feeling it out and testing your guesses. When you give that advice, do you feel like that is a bit of a challenge for some entrepreneurs to really get in that headspace that they're willing to go there, ask questions, be vulnerable? Because it's not always easy to say, I'm not sure if I've hit it right or if this is really how it's going to work. How are you finding them navigating that messy middle?
There's like an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And entrepreneurs tend to want to go fast, and they don't necessarily think a lot about those connections, to be honest with you. As businesses become more niche, as businesses become more specific in their offerings, and as more entrepreneurs enter into the market, that connection piece is critical. And we talked about when I was at ATB and knowing who's in the room. I think one thing that's really important to understand from an entrepreneur is when we say connect with entrepreneurs, I don't mean connect with entrepreneurs that sell the same thing you do necessarily. I've had the privilege of advising thousands of entrepreneurs through my whole career in helping entrepreneurs. And what I have found is it doesn't matter the industry, there is an underlying thread that connects all of them, and that's the entrepreneur piece, right? So, I've seen people that have learned from entrepreneurs in widely different industries. I've seen people that make technology learn from people in retail. I've seen people in manufacturing learn from people in straight service industry where they don't actually make anything, right? So opening up your mind a little bit about those connections, and you never know. And one thing I want to really go back and address a little bit is you made that comment about entrepreneurs thinking that, I don't know anybody. I didn't go to business school or anything like that. I grew up in a small town. I grew up in Peace River, Alberta. So northern Alberta,
Okay.
like a 500 kilometers north of Edmonton type of thing. Like it was up there. Right. And I spent 18 years there, and I was with ATB. And I was making a connection to someone at ATB, and this was someone at a different department. We'd had a couple of conversations, but that trust wasn't necessarily there yet. And and I've always stayed true to partnerships, and it's always been I feel a great skill of mine in my previous roles is the ability to build partnerships. And I've always taken that approach of like, hey, I'll share some of me, you share some of you, and let's see what's going on. And so with this individual, I was sharing a story about entrepreneurship, and I was like, hey, I love rural entrepreneurship. And I shared the story of how, I grew up in Peace River, and one of my best friends, his dad was an entrepreneur. He owned this business. And the guy was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Are you talking about? And he said the guy's name.
No way.
Yeah, he knew him. He was like, I used to be a banker up there. I know him. And so instantly there was this connection and this trust built that was like, I used to hang out with his son all the time. I'm one of his good friends. So like you never know when those connections, especially in that professional environment. And it may not be the connection that you think necessarily, but when you make that altruistic connection, people are more willing and able and capable of remembering you, right? And so if you just go in with that belief of and there's so many ways to say it, I'm a big believer in the rising tide. A rising tide raises all ships. Another way to think of it is, and this is no new idea. There's a book called Moments by Marcus Aurelius, like the Roman emperor.
Okay.
The guy that died at the beginning of Gladiator.
I'll have to watch it again.
That's Marcus Aurelius.
Funny.
He's a philosopher. He wrote this book, right?
Okay.
And in the book, he talks about this idea of organic unity. And organic unity, he kind of uses the metaphor of humanity in a tree. And he says, you want to be able to help somebody out, not because it's going to help you, but because it's going to help them. Like it's this idea that we think of ourselves as decentralized. And he said, no, you're a tree. If one part of a tree helps another, it helps themselves, right? Like that's the way that, and I think with entrepreneurship, especially, that organic unity is what we're talking about, right? Or that rising tide is what we're talking about. And part of that's vulnerability, right?
Yeah. And the idea of the tree, I had given a talk where I referenced the roots. So when you think of the tree in a forest, and I love to hike, and this idea of the roots and the root system that is so intricate, but at the same time, in a healthy forest, you also have that. I did some traveling in Costa Rica, and so you have that canopy that starts to happen at the top, and there's some life at the top. You obviously have done a lot of study, and the stats, and the people that you support now through your business, the entrepreneurs that you support, they're getting all of you and all of your background and experience. Did you see that when you were younger, that you just naturally moved into that? So
actually my family, my dad was a banker. Is a banker.
Okay,
and so that entrepreneurship world, we were always kind of connected. And I had, like I said, my friends' families that were in entrepreneurship, but I never thought of myself as a connector necessarily. Like I'm very actually introverted by nature. And a lot of people have this false assumption, if you're introverted, you can't connect, that, there's this idea. I used to be very socially awkward. I hated going out. And honestly, this whole idea of, I hated it. I hated going out and talking to people. It was so uncomfortable. Networking was the worst. That's what led me down this path of understanding how to make authentic connections, because as that introvert, for example, and as that person that was shy, that hated doing it, it was an easy out for me to just ask about them. It was an easy out, because who doesn't love talking about themselves, right?
Totally.
And I don't want to say that I stumbled a certain part of my body backwards into this solution. But I did. Like it came down to, like, I would be talking to people and I would just be asking questions about them, and they wouldn't stop. And then suddenly for me, I would get this connection point, this light bulb that'd be like, oh my gosh, I think I can help this person. And I'm going to shut up and I'm not going to say anything right now, but I see this connection. Right. And even sometimes if it wasn't with me, if it was a connection with somebody else, I was like, hey, like you mentioned this thing and you were having this issue. I was just talking to somebody else. You need to go and meet them, type of thing. I literally just stumbled backwards into this thing that happened to work for building relation. And it led to this confidence through practice. Right. And that's what it comes down to is, one of my favorite sayings is from Ben Franklin, and it's diligence is the mother of good fortune. It really comes down to, like, do it again and again and again and again. And like eventually, like those good luck stories, they're not good luck. They're someone that's consistently going at it and trying and trying and trying. Right.
Well, and what you're saying actually kind of feeds back into that tree analogy as well, where you knew yourself well enough that as you're listening, you're processing and you're saying, this is what I have to offer, or this is what where I'm coming from. And as you're hearing them talk, you're getting and gaining information about where they're at, what's important to them. When you're talking about that passion or the purpose pulling them,
Yeah.
and what are they driving towards? When you get that information, you can start to connect the dots, I think.
We talked a little bit about community. We talked a little bit about this idea of how do you adapt and how do you make sure that you're doing that type of thing. It all comes down to these authentic conversations. And one of the big things that I push to people is entrepreneurship. And entrepreneur is a verb. It's not a noun. It's an action word. It's not a title, right? And to me, the action words are entrepreneurs listen, they learn, and they lead. And there's this ability to get this feedback at every step of the way, right? And to build what you're doing in a more authentic way.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, because I know we've had that conversation about the title, that some people apply to themselves, and you see it all over LinkedIn. I see it in a lot of groups that I'm part of, where it's, first name, last name, entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And it always kind of, I have a little bit of a hiccup when I read that, because I'm like, to what, like, or why, or what are you creating? Or, and I think when you talk about entrepreneur-ish, the title of your book, how much more, I think, effective would we be if we got really specific on what is the change we're trying to make in the world, or what kind of problem are we solving? Give us a little bit about the book that's coming out. I guess that you've got a December release coming out.
Yeah, it's coming out here pretty quick. So Entrepreneur-ish is inspiration and lessons in entrepreneurship from Vikings, pirates, and samurai. When you talk about the inspiration for the book, as I've kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, I've been very lucky to talk to a lot of entrepreneurs through my career, right? And one thing that I found is that, we talked about how emotional intelligence is incredibly important for entrepreneurs. And for the most part, it is a very inclusive world, but the term is very exclusionary. And I would have people that would tell me, you're not an entrepreneur until you sell a business. You're not an entrepreneur until you pay taxes, until you avoid taxes, until you pay yourself a salary. It's like they all have these individual milestones in place. And it just frustrates me. It just, for me, was beyond frustrating, because it's not like, who are we to control that term? And when you look at, I'm a big believer in taking inspiration from different places. So today's as I said, my daughter's birthday. So she's turning 3. My son is 5, and he is an incredibly creative individual. He loves to color, to draw. He builds incredible Lego creations. He loves building train tracks and stuff. When he was younger, one of the things that we found was that when he was drawing, say, a fire truck, which is his absolute favorite thing in the world, is a fire truck, he would get frustrated when it didn't turn out the way that he wanted it to. He would scratch it out, put an X through, he would crumple it up, he would get emotionally, it was very a difficult thing. And my wife ended up finding a book called Ish. And this book was geared towards children and talked about how, hey, just because it doesn't necessarily look the way you thought it would in your head, doesn't mean that it's not inspirational to someone else. It doesn't mean that it's not a fire truck. It doesn't mean that it's not great in its own way. And for me, these two ideas just came colliding in my head of, well, why can't we apply that to entrepreneurship too? Why can't we apply that same idea? And I think the other thing that entrepreneurs often struggle with is things are going to change, and the business that you think you're going to create is not going to be what you think you're going to create, right? And you tie it back to that lock and key and the metaphor of finding the right market. Or I'll often say that as an entrepreneur, you have as much power as a surfer on a wave, right? Like the wave has the power, you control where you put the board and how you ride it, kind of, right? But this whole idea came from, well, let's look at other non-traditional sources of inspiration to really learn the actions of entrepreneurship. Because like I said, it's about action. It's not about title. I talk about strategy being the marriage between action and outcome. What I often find is, you're talking about partnerships where these outcomes are not happening. And I will always say, well, okay, but what are the actions? Like, do you understand the other side of the equation? Because there has to be another side of that equation. And often they will look at it from this perspective of, well, I really want to get this connection. I really want to do these things. I really want to, get this certain result. And I'll ask, okay, what are you putting into it? What are you doing? Well, I sent them an email a month ago and they haven't gotten back to me. And I'm like, what? So you're expecting them, and like, how busy are you as an entrepreneur, right? And so I think at the end of the day, it comes down to having some sort of action that you put into it and reevaluating. often when we talk about resources and what an entrepreneur has, their motivator is often money, right? Like at some capacity, they want a partnership or a relationship to convert into money, right? I'll often say that there's other aspects you need to be concerned with. You have other resources, you have your attention, your time, and your money. Money is the jet fuel that you put in the rocket. Attention and time is what you do to make sure it's not pointed at a mountainside.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
so it's okay with like say you are going after a partnership with a specific partner. You've given yourself a timeline. You've given yourself a certain number of like, what are the actions I'm going to take to get an outcome? Maybe it's I want a partnership agreement. So I want to be able to set up this process of an initial meeting, a follow-up meeting where I put together a draft of a partnership agreement. We give them a couple of weeks to kind of get back to me on it. And then we kind of revamp and go through for the final meeting. Maybe those are the actions that you potentially want to take. And that's really broad, right? At some point at the end of that timeline, you got to stop and you got to say, did it go well? Did it not go well? Why or why not? And is it worth actually pursuing? Like, was the time that you invested in it enough to prove or disprove that it was worth going after this relationship?
Well, and when it's done well, I was going to say perfectly.
Never perfectly.
Never perfectly.
Never perfectly.
When connections are happening and it's going well and you're seeing things, results kind of pop up, it's really important to me to find those universal threads that we can start applying in every part of our life, everything that we do, any way that we connect. What would be some of those things that you would draw out of your experience of connection in the entrepreneurship world that the rest of us could really benefit from doing some of those same things?
I'm laughing because I'm going to tell my wife's a great supporter in a lot of ways, and she loves when I do podcasts and stuff. She sends them to everybody she knows. And I'm going to make a joke that I'm sure she's going to hate. And so I need to preface that by saying that I love it. And I hope that she ends up laughing. She will. She's got a great sense of humor. But I want to talk about that emotional intelligence piece, right? Because we are living in a time right now when you look at the world and what's going on, where emotions, regardless of the conversation, have taken the main stage, right? And there are things that, regardless of beliefs, there was a time where the emotions would have been taken out, but now that doesn't happen anymore. Like, we as a society have become much more emotional, but at the same time, much more closed off to understanding the other person's emotional perspective, right? And, there was a really phenomenal book written called Never Split the Difference by I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I'll remember hopefully by the end of this, but he was a former FBI hostage, like a negotiator, right? And he talked about tactical empathy, I think is what it was called. And the joke that my wife I'm sure will hate is like, this book about how this guy talked to terrorists and how he talked to like these very incredibly unreasonable people gave me such insight into how to have conversations with my wife. Because like when you talk about the emotional perspective, I was so, and he says this really well in the book. He says, do you think we agreed with what they were saying? No, of course not. But we had to understand it. And there's a difference between those two things, right? And it's not. And I think that often, whether you look at it, and again, this is not a new concept. Stephen Covey talked about this in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that you need to listen from a perspective of understanding, not from a perspective of responding. And all too often we are caught in conversations where we just want to fire something back. We just want to say something back. But what you need to do, and whether it's in your business, with your customers, with your family, with your friends, with people that as colleagues, that ability to connect in an emotional world, in a digital world, in an emotional way is everything. And, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, people are feeling disconnected. People are feeling alone. People are feeling the very real mental stress of what is going on in the world, regardless of what their beliefs are. That stress is ubiquitous. And if we cannot be there to understand each other on that level, because emotions and logic are totally different, right? And so you need to understand when people are feeling stressed and be there to support them and understand that, hey, you can't control emotions. right? But you can control how you act with emotions. So I think that for me is where, when you look at technology and its advancements and you look at where we're going, emotional intelligence, like I said, is not going away. The ability to connect and understand from another person's perspective it's a very rare trait, and we need more of it in the world, right?
I feel like I just need to pass you a mic that you can drop. And I did pull up the Never Split the Difference book here because I did listen to it. I'm a big Audible fan, and
yeah, me too.
And had listened to this on a road trip once. And I love what you're saying here when we're talking about being strong in ourselves, kind of knowing where you're at, what you want to offer the world, and at the same time create space for understanding.
Totally,
create some kind of a way to interact with others. Yeah, I love that.
And again, like, I don't think these are new ideas, like even to dive back into, entrepreneur-ish, one of my favorite parts of the book is when we talk about the samurai. There was the samurai in particular that I kind of focus on is a gentleman named Miyamoto Musashi, and he was really phenomenal samurai. And this quote from him, and this is a paraphrase, but he essentially alludes to the fact that we have two eyes. And he said, the observant eye is strong because it sees what is there, and the perceptive eye is weak because it sees what is not there. And when you talk about emotions and how people interpret and understand and use them, they'll often use their perceptive eye and assume and guess and attribute things that aren't necessarily true without actually just taking a look at what's going on, right? And I think that's a part of that issue, is we're all too quick to kind of make that quick rash judgment and assumption, and then so unwilling to change our position when we're ingrained, right? When the very nature of life and entrepreneurship especially is adaptability and change. That's what it's all about.
Exactly. Well, and if I could kind of just put a little bow on that concept for the ones that are listening today that have maybe you're facing challenges in the year coming up, you've had to adapt and change, and not to feel like the next phase is where you've got it all cased, where you've now figured it out, and now you don't have to ask the questions, you don't have to be curious.
That's never going to come.
It's never going to come. And what a beautiful, I think, event planning space we can all be in if we have this desire to understand the other, which in our case might be our guests, it might be our partners, maybe our vendors, where we're really asking better questions, deeper questions.
Digging specifically into that event world, that idea of you being able to understand what their needs are and how you can adapt in this new world to provide that. It's absolutely everything, because those events are going to be more needed, and I'm sure that you talked about this in other podcasts, but the technology you can now use to connect those people, right? But if you don't have that connection point to really understand, like how many, and I'm sure you would have a wider knowledge of this, but I know of at least a few events that, when you talk about how long they've been around, how prestigious they are, that just collapsed because when they were threatened with the new digital world, they could not adapt to it, and the value just disappeared. And the credibility that you used to have and say, hey, we used to do this for 15 years or 16 years, that can just disappear if you don't adapt and change, right?
Beautiful example. Thank you so much, Jason. We could talk
all day.
Talk all day.
Absolutely.
And I'm really excited that you are part of the Candy Circle and part of our community here. I consider you a friend, not just for Candy and where we're going in our future and the cohorts that we're building in the next year, but personally, I really got so much out of today's conversation. And I believe so much that if people listen to this, and I think I could probably name a dozen nuggets, that if they took that one nugget away and started applying that tomorrow, it will change your game, a little bit every day. And so thank you so much for showing up and giving us so much to think on and chew on. And thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
So how can people find you if they want to continue this conversation moving forward? They want to learn more about what it means to connect well as an entrepreneur. Where can they find you?
There's a couple of different options. You can go to my website, which is sunstonestrategic.com. You can go to any of my social media. So LinkedIn is typically the best place to get a hold of me. You can, as my book Entrepreneurship is going to be coming out in the next little bit, I am going to be creating a newsletter that's kind of themed the same way, that comes out to kind of give those insights, inspirations, and hopefully some action tips for entrepreneurs as well. So feel free to go and sign up on my website as well.
That's awesome. And we will be watching for some kind of a book release coming up.
Absolutely. It'll be out in
Even
December
if we
here.
can't come and have drinks or something with you,
Totally.
we will watch online and share online. Thank you so much,
Awesome.
Jason, for being
Thank
with me. I so appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much.
The Connector Next Door podcast is produced by Candy Event Consulting, where everyday event planners and their teams gain clarity, get connected, and grow in confidence. Subscribe at www.candyconsulting.ca to hear visits with everyday event planners who are putting connections first.